In the streets of New York City, a criminal is cornered in a dark alley, surrounded by his dead comrades. He begs his aggressor to spare him, saying that he and his friends did everything this attacker asked of them. They stole the chemicals he wanted, so he should just leave the criminal alone. Spider-Man appears before the criminal, unafraid of the crook's gunfire, and kills the criminal in a single blow. Citizens of New York City look on, shocked at this act, begging Spider-Man to stop killing people, that this is their home and they don't want this. Spider-Man confirms that he killed these people, and if anyone gets in his way, if anyone challenges his rule over this town, they're next. At home, Mary Jane and Peter Parker are enjoying some time together when they see news of this on the television. Peter is shocked and dismayed at this, knowing someone out there is abusing the Spider-Man identity for their own criminal gain. Mary Jane is surprised more people don't actually do this. After all, imitating Spider-Man and the glamour of an outlaw in a mask must be pretty tempting for criminals across New York City. Peter isn't so impressed and says, regardless of what's happening, he's going to make sure there are no more killings in his name, and he's going to stop whoever's doing this. Meanwhile, a mob boss named Jeffrey Barnett is holed up in his headquarters. He is approached by a costume villain who introduces himself as the Master of Vengeance. The mob boss doesn't want anything to do with these costume freaks and has been deliberately avoiding Spider-Man ever since this vigilante started killing people. But the Master isn't interested in Barnett's personal philosophy when it comes to superheroes and villains. He demands Barnett's aid in stopping Spider-Man, and he says when the time comes to be ready or his vengeance will turn on Barnett next. The Master leaves and Barnett tells his people to get ready. They have a unique opportunity ahead of them to take the web crawler out, and when they're done with that, they'll deal with this Master next. In the streets, Peter finds the people that witnessed the murders, but when he tries to talk to them, they all flee. Having now witnessed the doppelganger Spider-Man and the violence he is capable of, they are afraid that this Spider-Man is coming for them next. Peter is unable to persuade them that he's a different Spider-Man, and when a journalist pursues Peter, asking about these murders, Spider-Man is forced to flee. Watching all of this is a man named Dwight. He's the one that's been posing as both Spider-Man and the Master of Vengeance, all in an effort to engineer his revenge against both Spider-Man, who got Dwight arrested after Dwight was making a number of drugs for Barnett's behalf. Because Barnett's the one who served Dwight up to Spider-Man, he's seeking revenge against both these figures, playing them off against each other in the hopes of getting both of them killed. Spider-Man is pursued by the journalists. Peter is able to give these journalists the slip and covertly follows them when news reaches the copter of the other Spider-Man currently climbing the World Trade Center with a hostage. Peter confronts this doppelganger, and Dwight in response drops the hostage, forcing Peter to dive after the innocent man, catching him in midair and delivering him to a group of firefighters. When the police pursue after Spider-Man, he takes off, looking to see where his evil doppelganger went. Back at his headquarters, Barnett continues to wait for the Master of Vengeance to return, only for a very different Master of Vengeance to show up. There's bad security here. Hiding behind their guns and their murders, these monsters think themselves secure. But anyone can use a gun. Anyone can die. Spider-Man is able to chase his doppelganger down, but Dwight turns on him, and thanks to a unique chemical compound he developed, he's able to use a new set of superpowers, Energy Blast, which he's able to use to blow Peter away. Dwight takes off, leading Spider-Man to Barnett's headquarters, only to find every one of the mobsters gunned down and dead by the Punisher's hand. Frank Castle recognizes Spider-Man, but quickly corrects himself. This is an imposter. His stance, his build, the way he moves, it's all wrong. Dwight blows the Punisher away and begins to flee, only for Spider-Man to confront him outside. The two get in a battle, this time with Peter ready for Dwight's incredible powers. He's able to dodge the energy blast using his spider sense and hit Dwight with a mighty, spider-powered blow. Though the villain is defeated, Peter's spider sense is still ringing. He turns around, and out loud, Peter wonders if his heart isn't pure, if he doesn't say his prayers at night. Why him? Why the Punisher? Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my recap and review of Spider-Man number 32. So Random Reviews has turned up yet another random decision in a 1993 comic that is one of the Spider-Man side series that really started to populate the Spider-Man and comic book publishing industry during the 1990s. There was a lot of Spider-Man content going around, so it makes sense that we spend a particular amount of time in the 1990s when it comes to just looking at Mary Jane reviews at random. After all, those comics are going to populate around when the character was most active and most prominent in the comics. So it makes sense that the 1990s, because she is so intimately tied with Spider-Man, is a huge time for Mary Jane, and a huge part of her character's history. After all, for the duration of the entire decade, these two were married together, something that really can't be said about any other decade in Spider-Man history. As such, it becomes unique in Mary Jane history and what her role was as a character. I will say there is a bit of a pattern emerging in these comics, where Mary Jane basically stays at home to give Peter advice and some grounding while he goes off on his fantastical adventures doing something completely unrelated to her or her story. But it isn't exactly like that, to be fair. She is still a character, she is still a person living her life, and it's very heavily implied while Peter's off doing his own stuff, she's off living her own life, and living a perhaps not as exciting life as Spider-Man, but a still pretty exciting life as an actor during this time. In the year following this issue, 1994, the Clone Saga would come about, and Mary Jane and Peter Parker's characters would essentially take a step back from Spider-Man canon as the focus would shift towards Ben Reilly. We actually won't be reviewing a comic book from that era, as I said, instead picking up after the Clone Saga, when these characters would return, and in my eyes, Mary Jane would start to take a more prominent role in Peter Parker's life. I mentioned in the last review that I like how Mary Jane is very much a partner and someone Peter can confide in when he's dealing with his latest challenge as a superhero and how it relates to some villain or another. This is all pretty typical Mary Jane stuff, but once they return post-Clone Saga, we're going to start to see her take a more prominent role in Peter's life and his overall decision-making and personal world, which I think really gives her character a bit more weight behind it. Because here, while her part isn't boring, and in fact I liked it, and it caused me to literally laugh out loud seeing Peter's reaction to some guy posing as Spider-Man and murdering people, it is a little bit lacking in having a lot of weight behind it. Mary Jane is just sort of here to have something for Peter to come home to right now. And beyond that, her character doesn't really feel like it serves much of a role. That will change, and I don't want to come down too hard on this comic, but it was something that I noticed and was a bit of a problem. But that kind of takes away from this comic itself and what it's really about, because what it's really about is a murderous Spider-Man, Peter Parker chasing him down, and ultimately coming into conflict with the Punisher because of it. And man, this comic is really a lot of fun because of all of that. This issue was written by Steve Grant, and he's a pretty big name in comic book history, with, when it comes down to comics that he's written, a list that is about a mile long at this point. He really nails this comic in a big way. It needs to be exactly what it sets out to be, a somewhat darker Spider-Man story, the one that I would consider pretty contemporary to its time, unlike the Frogman comic we just reviewed. And one that, works more than it doesn't to tell a really badass Punisher/Spider-Man story. That scene where the Punisher first appears and just guns down that mob is awesome, and a really kick-ass, classic Punisher moment. This is his character at his best, just doing Punisher things and getting into a superhero misunderstanding with Spider-Man because of it. One that feels very organic, I might add too. As Mary Jane points out, it makes sense for people to want to pose as Spider-Man since it's such an easy disguise to shift the blame onto somebody else for any number of crimes or vigilante behaviors, which is exactly what this Dwight guy is doing. So the Punisher initially does give Spider-Man the benefit of the doubt until he recognizes from the posture and gait of Dwight that this dude isn't really Spider-Man, decides to just go after him. So then when he leaves the building and sees a dude dressed as Spider-Man, of course he's going to attack. This feels like it works for the story and really feeds the already complicated relationship between Spider-Man and the Punisher. I really like these two together. It makes sense, the Punisher was, after all, introduced in a Spider-Man comic, but the fact that they are just so dichotomically opposed to each other. When the Punisher was gunning those people down, I really liked it, but it's also just something that doesn't fit in Spider-Man's world. And that's not necessarily a judgment against the Punisher. The comic kind of points out that these mobsters have just been deliberately avoiding Spider-Man so that they won't have to deal with his crap. But then the Punisher just comes along and takes them all out in one fell swoop like they're nothing. That's an interesting statement on these two characters, and it isn't really a judgment against Peter either. Peter is definitely the much more moral and righteous character in this scenario. Meanwhile, I just love the artwork of this comic. We're definitely getting into the more modern takes of Spider-Man and the artwork behind it that started to crop up in the 90s, stepping away from the more cartoonish and laid-back artwork and the tones behind it of the 60s, 70s, and even 80s when it comes to depicting Spider-Man. Now don't get me wrong, dark Spider-Man stories have been going on since the Jerry Conway days back in the 1970s, but this is a whole different animal. Way more people are dying in this comic, but even the coloring and tone take on a very different aspect compared to the comics we've been looking at before. But it's also a lot more realistic in how it depicts people, giving the comic a certain edge to it that really fills out the nature of this comic nicely. Given that we have the Punisher just gunning down a room full of people, it really makes a difference to have a more realistic looking Punisher. I keep thinking about this last image in this issue, where the Punisher just has Peter at gunpoint, and they use the different perspectives to really give this moment a strong, realistic feeling to it that makes this moment feel really tense and want you to read what happens next. This is part one of a 3-part story that would be going on in the Spider-Man series. And I did check out what happens going forward. Basically, Vengeance, the Punisher, and Spider-Man dance around each other for a couple issues before things eventually get resolved. It's a great story just the same, and I would recommend the whole thing, even if there aren't a ton of twists and turns beyond that. And in spite of a couple dated moments here and there, once again Peter Parker uses a payphone and there's a whole set piece built around the World Trade Center, but I give all of that stuff a huge pass. They couldn't have known these things would ultimately become dated over time when they were making this comic back in 1993. And more importantly, little things like that don't make a comic book feel all that dated. Next up, from what I've seen, is a comic that is way more dated and way less excusably so, as we look at a comic on the other side of the veil of the Clone Saga. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching this video. If you like Comic Island, be sure to check out our Patreon page, the link to which you can find in our video description below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.